mean, I was doing a podcast with, he's a like law professor. He studied in UCLA, and he was a student when Edward Said actually visited just before Iraq invasion. And he still remember, how like, the other groups came with full force and tried to stop his speech. I mean,
Mhm.
uh, and if I read this speech again and again, I can see like he was really worried, what America will do to this country,
Mhm.
and then how Iraqis are feeling right now. So that perception is not there at all. So
Oh
the
no.
kind of like knowledge was already created that these people are actually problematic, and we need to do something about that.
Oh yeah, I mean that is in a way the core argument of
Mm,
Orientalism. I mean, it's not that I was reading this particular page where he says it's not we don't just say that here is the real Orient, you're not
mm,
representing it, but
mm,
that the European subject, political subject, encounters the Orient as already pre-constituted,
mm,
right? So for Iraq war to happen, there needed to be a larger cultural conception of Iraq as a hostile place,
mm,
as a place that needed to be controlled, as a place that was threatening. And it was under those registers that a war could be sold.
mm,
And that, in its essence, is the modern form of Orientalism, that you don't even have to give facts, you can fabricate things,
mm, mm,
but
mm,
you can move a large segment of your society against a country based on those assumptions. And that is Orientalism, right? Because, like Said in his introduction, what I think he's trying to highlight is, I mean, he's using Foucault, he
yeah.
acknowledges that, is that it's a body of knowledge perpetuated through conferences, through academia, through journals, newspapers, all of them assuming and representing certain things about a place called the Orient or Iraq.
Mm,
So, thus, people are incapable of thinking outside of that discourse. So,
mm,
when you mention Iraq and Saddam Hussein to them, it already, I mean, it comes across in his book Covering Islam, if you
mm,
remember,
mm,
he
yeah.
talks about how the Muslims are already
Mm,
pre-constituted as terrorists, as weak, as needed to be put down.
mm, mm,
And all those tropes then emerge in these war rhetorics.
mm, mm,
If you remember, before the invasion of Afghanistan, after September 11, everywhere, you know, these images were emerging of women in the burqas. And it was, as Gayatri Spivak famously says, it was white men saving brown women from brown men, right?
mm. But
That,
but but also like brown man is also irrational,
yeah,
terrorist,
yeah,
domineering,
yeah,
vicious, all kind of tropes there as well.
yeah. So, I mean, so I think that a lot of people read Orientalism incorrectly,
Mm,
because people come, my students used to come to me and say, well, there is no agency here that we see, that the Orients themselves have something to say. And that
mm,
was one of the biggest critiques of Said. And Said actually, in the afterword and even in the introduction,
mm,
clearly says that the project here is not to prove what acts of resistance were mobilized by the Orientals themselves.
mm,
His project was to suggest that there is a discourse called
mm,
Orientalism, which is perpetuated through knowledge, through power of being there and being able to record,
mm,
to have the power to conquer Egypt and then record it
mm, mm,
from your own scientific so-called perspective. So within that, the book's project was to give us a genealogy of how Orientalism
mm,
established itself and how it works.
mm, mm,
And then he goes on in his other works to then tell us, how the natives responded, how they resisted.
mm,
There is, um, There's an interview of Said, I think it's available on YouTube as well, where he explains that. I mean, he explains in simpler terms that what he wanted to write about was as to why is it that when the Arab word is mentioned or the Middle East is mentioned in the Western press or to a common person in America or UK or Scotland,
Mm,
certain ideas about that place emerge in people's mind. Where do those ideas come from?
mm, mm,
And that is what he tries to explain
mm,
through the term Orientalism. And I think for anyone, any scholar who wants to work on the global periphery or a clear understanding of how political discourses work, I think Said is important,
mm,
especially Orientalism.
mm. In the opening of the book, I mean, he mentioned about this Disraeli's quote that East is a career. I think that's
Mhm.
an amazing quote.
Oh yeah,
Can you expand on
I
that?
think it's from Tancred, which
Yeah.
was one of the three novels, I think. So I mean, well, I mean, think of it what did colonialism enable the British merchant classes and nobles to do? Now, if you are of course more familiar with that, I mean, in the feudal system of British, even though the colonialism had risen, only the primogenitor, and only the eldest son would
Mm,
inherit the estate. That means the second sons and third sons of the nobility had to go and find their own fortune.
mm,
Where did they find their fortunes? In the colonies. One way of doing that was that the second sons would go to the Caribbean, to the Creole families, to the white Creole families. And since the white Creole families wanted to marry their sons and daughters into the merchant classes or the nobility, they will give a dowry, sometimes 60,000 pounds, 30,000 pounds. So these second sons will go to the Caribbean, get married to a Creole woman, and that would fund their
mm,
success. The greatest example of that is Jane Eyre, the novel in which
mhm,
Rochester brings Bertha Mason to London because she is his wife and she gives the capital with which he starts their life.
mm,
So that's like one way of seeing the East being a career. But
mm,
literally, for so many of the upper middle class young men,
mm,
the entire system of British civil services that was expanded to the colonies, you know, you didn't just go there, you
mm,
enjoyed a certain lifestyle,
mm,
certain privileges.
mm,
And so that's just in terms of as government functionaries. But
mm,
as writers, if you want to write imaginative fiction or a travelogue, East was a career for you, because you traveled to Egypt and what did you write? The
mm,
Maya account of Egypt. Even Burton smuggles himself to the Holy Kaaba and writes an account of that.
mm,
Writing about the Orient or using Oriental tropes in
mm,
poetry. It goes all the way back to the Divine Comedy, even. You know, uh, so East has always been a career,
mm, mm,
Orient, especially for the writers, for the
mm,
painters, the Dutch Impressionists, and everyone else, because but how because that mystery about it, that
mm,
sexualized images, that timelessness that was
mm,
associated with it, in all those senses. I mean, Disraeli is writing in the book that I think the dialogue is East isn't a place, it's a career, right? But what
mm,
Said is then proving in the book is
mm,
how does it become a career,
mm,
right?
mm,
I mean, it generates discourses, it creates societies,
mm,
conferences,
mm,
institutions of Oriental studies,
mm,
journals,
mm,
right? And experts in Orientalism.
mm,
So you if if England is sending out an expedition somewhere, you will have your experts tell you how to tame the natives. How, but
mm,
think of it, we think in terms of the past.
mm,
When Bush the second was
mm,
getting ready to invade Iraq, right?
mm.
Who were the experts around him, right? Bernard Lewis
Yeah,
and all these neoconservatives,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Who had this idea of you can't talk to the Arabs, you have to
Mm,
conquer them. It was the same career, like these
mm,
experts,
mm,
whispering things and presenting things to the powerful. And I think what Saeed is saying is, it's not just an unmotivated encounter. It's an encounter that already is pre-constituted through the power dynamics,
mm,
and it's imbued with all kinds of imaginative things associated with the region.
mm,
There's an example he gives in one of his interviews is that he was reading Lang, his history of the Arab people,
mm.
and then he was reading Nerwal,
Yeah.
and he said what he realized was that the poet was saying the same thing that the historian had said, and it struck him that no one was experiencing the Orient as it is. They would go there with their expected view already shaped. And I
Mm,
always use this example in my classes when I was trying to explain this is that think of it this way. Uh, you're going to Jamaica.
mm, mm,
One way of going to Jamaica is you buy a ticket and you just get there, but it's never that. Even before you decide to go to Jamaica, there are certain views that you already have, beaches, free
mm,
drinks.
mm,
But more than that, let's say you buy a travel book before
mm,
you go there. So then Jamaica for you is 10 best things to do in Jamaica. Your experience of Jamaica then is, oh, this wasn't as good as the travel book said.
mm,
So that, in that sense, then the expectations of the place or people are already shaped in your
mm,
mind, in your consciousness. So even before you've met them, you have an opinion of them. And when you
mm,
meet them, all you are looking at is, does it match the opinion that I've already formed?
mm, mm. I mean, like in my case, one of the example I give, like what like Edward Said also mentioned about John Stuart Mill's father, James Mill. So he's like a Scottish Enlightenment thinker. So he
Mhm.
was very famous. So his friends are like like all those famous economists like Ricardo. But he suddenly he decided to write on India.
Mhm.
I mean, not only he wrote like a book, he wrote like 6 volumes on India. Never been to India, knew
Mhm.
nothing about India. But the problem is what you said, the East is a career, but lots of
Mhm.
people, lots of students who will go to like Oxford, Cambridge, other universities, will actually learn from his book about India. And these same people will be posted in
Yeah.
those colonies. So these are not innocent writing because they have those perception about the country, which is already they know that these people are actually weak. These people are bad. Their weather is bad. Their religion is like backdated. All kind of like
Oh, yeah.
things are already there. So what I think that's why the colonial setting creates so much violence against the like local people because these are not actually human beings.
They are not seen as equal human
Yeah,
beings.
yeah.
I mean,
So
you can see that like there was in the 18th or early 19th century, there was a scientific text that was taught, which was called the wild man's pedigree, or I'm forgetting. And in that, they would associate different attributes to different races. So white, and they would explain it through humoral theory.
mm, mm,
So white was sanguine because its dominant humor was blood, right? Black was phlegmatic because its dominant humor was phlegm, right? So
mm,
these were things were being taught as science, right? And obviously, like when when you're trained like that, and even your leisure reading, I mean, we don't talk about it in literature classes, but a huge genre, subgenre of 19th, 20th century literature was the sexual tales of the Orient. You
mm,
know, it would be exploits of a young officer in Peshawar and then his encounters with different women. So like there was one book called Venus in India. It was very popular amongst the British officers, right? So these men already went into India, not just expecting that these people are less than human or all, but also that this was a place where you could have all your desires fulfilled
mm,
and and unrestrained desires.
mm,
And you couple that with these are our conquered people, right?
mm,
Um,
mm,
uh, so absolutely, I mean, East as a career literally was a career for those who could have never succeeded in their own culture, but it also gave them this entire realm of imagination
mm,
and then writing about it, you
mm,
know.
mm.
Uh, Even now, I mean, think of the fiction or non-fiction accounts being published here in United States. I mean, how many books can you sell? I visited Alabama, right? But you can always sell a book, my 7 years in Tibet, right?
Yeah,
Or, 2 years in the Chittagong Hill tribes, right?
yeah, yeah.
Because that's exotic. It's already has been exoticized.
Mm,
Uh, so it becomes a career.
mm, mm,
Even now, it plays that role.
mm. And especially you kind of mentioned about like Bernard Lewis when he was hired as an expert on Iraq. I mean, like people like Edward Said, obviously horrified. He was still alive then. And in his lifetime, he spent like, he was saying this guy is racist. I mean, so
Yeah, and Said
whole
mentions
career.
that Orientalism too in the afterword. The problem with Daniel Pipes and Bernard Lewis and these people is what Said used to say. I think I saw it in that one thing about the Orientalists, the 19th century Orientalists, was that they at least loved their
Yeah,
subject.
yeah.
They they romanticized it, but they at least loved the Orient. The problem with the Arabists, right, Bernard Lewis and others, is that they hate the
Mm,
subject that they are supposed to be experts in.
mm,
Um, and, and I actually reviewed a book by a historian. Um, he was, I think, at the Naval War College, and
mm,
his book was. And the thing is, the problem with the American right is that there, and I mentioned it in my review, is that there is no review process. Right? I actually went and wrote an article on it too, is that this person's second chapter was and slay the idolaters, right? Which is from Surah At-Tawbah, right?
okay.
And so what he's arguing is that the Quran tells the Muslims to kill all non-Muslims, right? And 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 for an uncritical reader, he's citing the Quran, he's citing a verse of it. But what he's not citing is that At-Tawbah is the only chapter of the Quran which doesn't have the exordium Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. It doesn't start with God the compassionate and merciful. And
Mm,
two, before that verse is there, there is a set of verses which says this is the culmination point of your conflict with your enemies. You've exhausted all your options.
mm,
They have now broken treaties.
mm,
Now you must fight, right?
mm.
So 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 both the Muslim right wingers and these people, they misread it, right? And
Yeah.
so I went and wrote, I think, an article which was called Jihad in Islam, just as a response to that. But going back to this scholar who claimed to be an Arabist, claimed to be a Muslim scholar,
Mm,
cherry picking the thing that he could use to represent that Islam, by its very nature,
mm,
inherently is
mm,
anti-West and anti-human, right?
mm, mm,
And that's the kind of thing that Said would challenge them on, right? He was like, no, it's not as simple as that. And which we need to do too, because I mean, I don't know if you have had a chance to take a look at my book that just came out in February. That's what I was trying to do in that democratic criticism.
mm,
My main concern was, okay, yes, I believe in freedom of expression, but I teach graduate students in a world where we also teach them, we have to be careful of others' feelings. We have to be careful of, we have to at least understand and empathize why people feel a certain way.
mm,
Why aren't we teaching that to them? Right?
mm,
So
mm,
that's about Muslims, right?
mm,
So if a text hurts general Muslim sensitivities, makes
mm,
them sad or angry,
mm,
instead of telling them, oh, you should grow up, we can say things like that. Why don't we try to understand that anguish?
mm, mm,
Where does it come from?
mm, mm,
In order to do that, we'll have to understand what their idea of the sacred is. What is sacred to them? What is it that they think? What is the limit beyond which they would not want you to go? Right?
mm, mm,
It's not like the Muslim reader cannot tolerate criticism of their mullahs and readers and everything else. Of course they can.
mm,
So that was what that book was about. Like, obviously, I could have not written it had I
mm,
not read Said and people
mm.
like him. Um,
I mean, if you want to touch like the modern stuff, what's going on, especially after 9/11, um, like I think one of the latest report came from like Brown University. So they did a kind of cost analysis of the war on terror. So basically, they are saying that it it cost $8 trillion this 20 years war. It killed almost 1 million people. That's the like lowest estimate. And they went after like especially like 12 countries. These are the like poorest of the poor countries, and
mhm.
all are 99% are Muslim countries. So it shows the power of that
Discourse.
discourse and the Orient. You just went after them year after year, and then spent serious amount of money, and most of the money obviously came from the taxpayers as well. So taxpayers also understood that discourse that yeah, this makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, and also like, and this comes from like the neoliberal critiques of neoliberalism and others, is that since the Western government, like the US government, even though Biden is trying it, since they can no longer justify themselves through good works, right? They can't go and say, I'll give you free education and free
Mm,
health care, right?
mm,
So they've increasingly become security states, right?
mm,
So they would say, well, you're on your own if you don't have health care. But if someone tries to threaten you, we have the biggest military in the world to, to protect you. So these liberal states have increasingly become police states, right?
mm, mm,
Because that's easier to sell. We will make stricter laws to keep these undesirables out, to punish them, to give them the maximum sentence, and we will send our army to stem the tide of terrorism before it reaches our soil.
mm,
That sells better, right?
mm,
It's easier to sell fear to the people
mm,
and make them uncritical. And it feeds the large military industrial complex, right?
mm,
I mean,
mm,
where are you going to test your weapons? I mean, as
mm,
cynical as it sounds, I mean, if you look at Afghanistan, all
mm,
the major new weapon systems were tested there. Same in Iraq. It's now happening in Ukraine. Um, I mean, I am for supporting Ukraine against Russia. I'm against any aggression against any nation.
mm,
But on the other hand, if we want to do peace, right? Peace.
mm,
I always gave this example to my students. I mean, okay, if you the one narrative that was sold was that in Iraq we will create a viable democracy,
mm,
right? Which was, if you really wanted to do that, if United States wants to do that, solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's a tiny little state of Palestine with like 7 million people.
mm,
pump in, $50 billion into that state. It already has the most educated Arab population in the world. It already has the most resilient young population. Create the state of Israel, give them the resources, and within 10 years, they will build themselves as a model democracy in the Middle East without a military intervention. They have stayed democratic over the last 70 years, despite what is being done to them,
mm,
right?
mm,
But since that doesn't make sense, that doesn't sell well, right?
mm,
Because peace doesn't sell well, especially, I mean, it would be hard to convince the American public to say we are going to take $15 billion and reconstruct Palestine than saying there is a threat coming to us from Mali and we need to send an expedition and it will cost $50 billion. That's easier to sell.
mm, mm, mm,
Cynical as it sounds, because war in the name of security.
mm, mm,
So I think, like, I mean, what can you, me, and everyone else do is to continue speaking about these things,
mm,
continue pointing it out. I mean, that's the least we can do, other
mm,
than actually putting our bodies in the street and working with other groups in solidarity for peace, for greater understanding.
But also, like when you talk about like democracy, the mass. So even if you see like this war on terror, it looks like mass is co-opted in that war.
Yeah,
Um, so these are not a small number. We are talking about 80, 100 million, which is like most of this
yeah.
evangelical Christians and the right wing, the conservatives, the Republicans. It's a big number. It's a big number.
Oh, yeah. I mean, like, look at it. I mean, 48% of Americans were
Mm,
for that, are for that. And that's not a small number in the most powerful nation on the planet.
mm,
And part of it is also, I mean, if you look at the American educational system,
mm,
it
mm,
is increasingly the K-12 system. I'm not even talking about universities.
mm,
What's being the way the government's provided education is being run is we are increasingly producing less and less critical citizens.
mm,
The emphasis is on rote memory and testing,
mm, mm,
and not on critical thinking or asking good questions. There is hardly any civic education being given. And
mm,
if you are in a conservative state, chances are you're not even being taught real history. Not real history, but a complicated history, like in Texas or in Florida. So increasing, and that's the problem with the conservative politics anywhere, is that
mm,
they need an uncritical population, a
mm,
population that can do the computations and
mm,
do the jobs that are needed,
mm,
but that are not critically aware of why their lived conditions are like that. And that's why you see in UK and here too, is that there is emphasis on more vocational education,
yeah,
and all attempts at creating a debate oriented classroom or a classroom that encourages students to think critically of the nation, of their own privilege,
mm,
are made to look suspect, because if people start doing that, then it's harder to sell them simplistic narratives.
mm, mm. I mean, I think I'm the first person who started some studies on Middle East in my university. um, I mean, like most of the students who come to my course, like it's a like fourth year module, advanced course. I mean, most of them have got no understanding, previous background about any understanding about Middle East. So that their understanding about the popular media and it's quite fascinating that the way they start and the way they finish. And then I try to be in touch with my former students and at least I feel that these students will be like more humane, more
Mhm.
you know compassionate about the understanding about the Middle East. about the Arab world, about the Muslims. So I think that's the only thing you can get out of this.
As teachers and as public scholars, I mean, the most I think we can do is at least complicate the simplistic picture
Mm,
and focus on empathy and understanding. And I would say at both ends of the global divide. Like when I am in Pakistan,
mm,
my attempt always is to humanize Americans for them,
mm, mm,
and to always point out that yes, there are a lot of racists in United States and UK, but there are millions upon millions of decent human beings as well,
mm,
because it's important to acknowledge that, you
mm,
know otherwise both sides would keep thinking of each other as this other,
mm,
in that orientalist mode, right? And not see each other on a human level
mm, mm,
as fellow humans.
mm,
But you're right, like I can tell you that one person with a different set of texts and a different way of looking at things at any given institution, even when they are not even forcefully arguing one way or the other,
mm, mm,
can make a huge difference in students' lives. Sometimes they might have never encountered a text from, you know, Iran or
mm,
Bangladesh or India or Pakistan. Sometimes they might have never had an intellectual conversation from someone from out there.
mm, mm,
So, I mean, not just that it gives them new knowledges, it kind of humanizes the other for
mm,
them,
mm, mm,
which is important, especially in societies that are predominantly one ethnic group or, you
mm,
know, one social or class.
mm. The things you're talking about, this critical thinking, even in the academic sectors. So these things are now coming out, like, even our university's connection with the slavery, even like one of our buildings, like the teaching buildings called Dalhousie building. So like
Oh,
Dalhousie's are that, the colonial rulers in India. So we have different memories about
mm,
this like dynasty. I mean, but here it's like they're well respected. They are like well like revered, so they are the earls, they are the dukes. So I'm not sure outside mentioned about, I think outside talked about Balfour, but no,
oh
I think
yeah.
two of the people who did like more dangerous things for the Middle East, which is like Sykes-Picot Treaty. So like
Mhm.
Sykes-Picot Treaty, I mean, even the if you see the Picot guy, the French guy, I mean, his party's name is actually Colonial Party.
Mhm. Oh yeah.
So he became expert on the Middle East, and the other guy, the Sykes, he's just a kind of traveler in like Turkey and
Mhm.
other places, and suddenly he became an expert on the Middle East. And then these two people more or less drew the map of the whole.
Yeah. And like if you look at his discussion of Balfour's
Mm, mm,
statement, I think what Said is also trying to highlight isn't just what Balfour says about Egypt,
mm,
but the way it is said. Is that the vocabularies that are used are the vocabularies of Egypt being this little
mm,
uh, brother, or this not autonomous enough to take care of its own affairs, still needing a firm hand and guidance from the benevolent British Empire. All of these ways of, I mean, think of it, India, if you look at Indian history,
mm,
even Churchill's argument was that Indians are not ready for self governance. Right? The idea of not being ready was attributed to not being educated enough, not being civilized enough. And meanwhile, people like me and you are saying, well, you had 250 years. If you had given them the full right to develop their systems and infrastructures and universities, why wouldn't they have been ready? Right?
mm,
So, but this idea somehow that they are not ready to take, the same argument was used post Iraq war, that Iraqis are not ready to self
mm,
govern themselves.
mm,
Uh, uh, and meanwhile, I mean, we have a nation here, United States of America, you know, 100 years after its inception, it still wasn't ready to self-govern. It had to fight a war in which millions died, right? To settle the what
mm,
would it be. So the same things are not applied to the European nations. So that whole idea of like treating the colonies as childlike, I mean,
mm, mm,
as
mm,
uh, like Bergson would say, like natives as children,
mm,
and, and not considering them adults. That trope still plays.
mm,
Uh, Within these cultures, people use that for minorities. Like this community is,
mm,
they are not capable of taking care of themselves, and
mm,
they need to be instructed or controlled.
mm. It's almost like a kind of like narcissist
Yeah,
kind
it's like
of.
the infantilization of the other, right? Like that you never treat them as
Mm.
fully realized human beings.
Rather than saying that we actually destroyed them,
Yeah.
we took everything from them.
Yeah, and withheld the new knowledges that
Mm,
could have, you know.
mm,
Yeah, I always use this example. I mean, there are a lot of apologists for colonialism in India, Pakistan, and I'm sure Bangladesh too, especially older generations.
mm, mm,
Because the British apologist who's like, we built this and that. My argument always is pretty simple in infrastructural terms.
mm,
If Indian resources were used on India during those 200 years, then the British lead was New Delhi infrastructurally equally as developed as the city of London. If it wasn't, then it was an exploitative relationship. If you read Achille Mbembe and others, the biggest disadvantage to the colonial societies was not just infrastructural, it was that while the West was developing its discourses of liberty, freedom, feminism, all that,
mm,
and this comes from Chandra Mohanty's work too, since in the colonies the emphasis was to keep peace, like the local officials would work through the tribal elders,
mm,
through the feudal lords. So while these systems were being disrupted in the West, they actually become hardened under colonialism, right?
mm,
The mullahs become stronger because you're using them to control the people. The feudal lords become stronger because they keep the peace and you get your taxes and you tell them we will not interfere in your affairs. So all the disruptive impact of modernity and capitalism
mm, mm,
is stymied, and we come out with systems more ossified than what we had when they came in,
mm, mm,
and reactionary.
mm,
So, I mean, and that's the problem in let's say Islamic radicalism in Bangladesh, Jamaat Islami in Pakistan, is that if you are going to define your cultural identity in opposition to modernity,
mm,
where are you? Because modernity is a contaminated experience for you because of colonialism. So
mm,
you are going to go retrieve pre-modern ways of looking at the world from your own history,
mm,
and that sends us on this journey of pure identities,
mm,
and that is a consequence of the colonial experience. I mean, if modernity had entered the Muslim world or all the other worlds as a free movement of ideas and thoughts, then we would have adopted some of them, we would have rejected some of them, but it would have not become politically a contaminating influence.
mm, mm,
But because of colonialism, it did.
mm,
So if you are in Bangladesh or Pakistan, and you're fighting for any kind of rights, you have to cut through the objections that would come from traditional interpretations of gender, traditional interpretations of what is proper, what is not, because it's so easy now to dismiss, oh, that's a Western thing, right?
mm,
From their point of view. My idea is that there is so much good here that everyone can adopt, and there is so much good in our cultures
mm,
that
mm,
can infuse the capitalistic world with something
mm,
kind and generous and different ways of thinking the world and living in it.
mm. Because you are expert on like post-colonial theory as well, which more or less talks about it's not on the colonial time, but after the colonial time, why there are still problems there.
Mhm.
So, like, what's your understanding? Like, I mean, where we can actually liberate those colonies is still actually, no, they are still colonies, looks like. So India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, you can see the struggle, the oppression. It looks it's just a different form, uh,
Mhm.
but the structure is almost same.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
I mean, I see
Well,
some of your tweets about, like, even like you talk about Imran Khan. So you are quite critical about Imran Khan. You know, the how the
oh yeah. I think.
populism, you
Yeah,
know, kind
I
of.
mean, he his way of look, he his politics is reactionary, and it's not useful for Pakistan or for any country, because a disruptive politics like that, which doesn't have an end goal. I
Mm,
mean, what is he going to do? Change the Pakistani society? How? There is no plan to break the big feudal zamindari system. There is no plan to rein in the religious fundamentalists, right? Though those people are standing with him. So at the end of the day, all he's offering is elect me the prime minister and I'll negotiate with IMF differently. I mean, there is no imagining that I can go to India and Bangladesh and 50 other countries and say, let's build a coalition and become a bloc against IMF policies and say, we will not pay your debts.
mm,
You will forgive the debt.
mm,
I mean, there is no thinking of that sort, right?
mm,
Now, the global economic system, the way it is functioning right now, it needs the global poor
mm,
for the rich parts of the world to sustain, right?
mm,
So the solution isn't we're going to meet your requirement, give us another $2 billion, right?
mm,
Because if we are caught in a debt trap, we are actually working for IMF, right?
mm,
The
mm.
solution is for leaders of these nations to come together, people to come together and say, 50 countries of the world come together and tell
Yeah.
the IMF, we are not going to pay your debt. What
Mm,
are they going to do? Bankrupt 50 countries? You bankrupt 50 countries, the global economy would tank, right?
mm,
But and I don't know, you must be familiar with it. There is an organization, loosely affiliated organization, World Social Forum,
yeah.
right? They meet every year when Davos happens. And so that's where a lot of these new leftist, socialistic, but also global ideas are emerging
Mm,
of resistance and of cutting across the divides of religion and nation state, right?
mm,
And building alliances, people to people alliances.
mm,
So I think something of that sort, not led by the leaders, but by the
mm,
people who force their leaders to think in global and planetary terms. And I think the environmental justice movement
yeah.
is kind
Mm,
of leading the fray
mm,
in that,
mm,
but is not good
mm.
for a lot of people on this planet.
But at the same time, it helps the West, you know,
Oh,
the structure they love, and
oh
then
yeah,
they actually perpetuate the same discourse that look at them. These people are just,
yeah.
they cannot take care of themselves. These leaders are corrupt. These leaders are, all
Mhm.
kind of tropes there, and then more or less maintain the same structure.
Oh yeah.
So if they want anything, we'll supply them arms, not that things they
Mhm.
actually need. I mean,
Oh, absolutely. I mean, remember when those civil wars were happening in Africa, like Charles Taylor and others? The German suppliers were supplying both sides.
yeah,
They
yeah,
were selling arms to both sides.
mm, mm,
I mean, so I mean, pointing out these things is also important.
mm,
Like
mm,
Chomsky is great at doing that.
mm,
Uh, uh, my mentor, Robin Goodman, has done a great job in her work of
mm,
pointing out these. I have done it. A lot of other scholars, of course,
yeah,
Said did that. Um, but I think, like as scholars, and you being an active scholar at a university, I think the least what we cannot do is absolutely abdicate our responsibility
mm,
and become
mm,
part of the system. I
mm,
think the least that we must keep alive is sharing of these ideas and constantly
mm,
producing knowledges, but also
mm, mm,
sharing these thoughts and ideas and knowledges with our students. And then
mm,
what they do with it is up to them.
mm, mm.